So these are a few words about her background. First thing was, ironically, this picture here is stopped at wrote Mum with some wrapping paper. And just a little background to it. One of her biggest pleasures in life was making something from nothing. And for many Christmases, she used to get more excited about being able to have some nice wrapping paper she could reuse. She was ahead of her time in terms of austerity and recycling. With her sister-in-law Jean, they used to fight over the wrapping paper at Christmas. Anyway, so Mum was born on the 10th of November in Erdington, Birmingham, which is probably more well known for the Spaghetti Junction these days. Her parents were George and Nesta Lyon, and they liked the moniker Merle, M-E-R-L, so her proper full name was Margaret Elizabeth Rosemary Lyon. And so we knew she was known as Rosemary for most of her life. The Lyon family was an old Scottish family that had its lands in Perthshire in the 11th century. And the derivation of the name originally came from Leone from Rome, and we have a family tree where it goes right back to Sir John Lyon, and before that apparently was Robert the Bruce. But our particular branch of the Lyon family sort of ended with my mother's brother, who died at the age of 9, so there were no more male relatives to carry on the line. If you ask Mum where her spiritual home, it was a place called Glen Ogle, which is near Forfar. Is that right, Rosa? Forfar. That's the correct. The English say Forfar, but it's Forfar, just above Dundee. And the family had a few acres of land there, and her father George studied agriculture at Cirencester College, but they soon realised there was no money in farming in those days, particularly during the war, so he took on a role as a civil servant, as a factory worker. So the early life consisted of travelling around the UK with the family, and they would go to various different places, such as Birmingham. They went on to Stourbridge, Cardiff, Leeds, Ayr, Dundee, all very good football teams. But she was happiest whenever she returned to Glen Ogle in the holidays, and she would regale stories of her playing in and around, and the glens around there. That's where she had vivid memories. In the early 40s, she went to Domestic Science College in Edinburgh, and she met Bruce, her husband-to-be, who some of you will remember. He was up there for army training. They then had a honeymoon in Derby for a couple of days because Bruce was sent away in the war for the first 4 years of their married life, I believe. So Rosemary moved to Leicester in about 1942, and she brought up we 3 boys. And Bruce ran the family business called Mackay Brothers with brother Bill, whose relatives Claire and Gillian and Robert are with us. That's because Bruce and Bill's father died at the age of 14. He had to go into the family business. They then moved to the countryside in Leicestershire, a place called Burton Overy, near Market Harborough. The 3 boys fled the nest, and so Mum ventured back into teaching as domestic science teacher in inner city Leicester, which was quite a challenge, I gather. Anyway, retirement beckoned for them, and they were looking for somewhere warmer. Particularly my father didn't like the cold, and they thought about places like Norfolk, but they eventually settled on Thurleston because they used to come down and they would spend a few days with Claire and Colin's parents, who holidayed in Salcombe. So when they first moved down, they joined in local clubs and they integrated themselves into the South Hams community. Her early days were supplying a Salcombe cafe, which I believe that then became the Crew clothing shop. And she used to make homemade pate and that sort of thing. And latter days she would help with the ironing in Kingsbury's charity shop. Neil will go on to the more modern stuff, really. Just quickly fast forwarding to her last few weeks. She would never complain about how she was feeling, only that you might get the odd response as to how do you feel at the moment, Mum? She might say, a bit mouldy. That was her remedy. There were two doctors she relied on. One was Dr. Time, who was always there for best medical advice, and Sue Dwyer often used to be quoted as offering her very good advice, so thank you to Sue, who I know is here today. Anyway, for her last, she raised her game to make 100th, which we are all eternally grateful for. But she started to go downhill after that. I came down here for a few days to give Neil a break, and he and Jenny went off so they could have a bit of rest. And I was sleeping in the next bedroom, and I heard this little voice shout out, "Andy." I thought, oh, bloody hell, so this is why I'm down here, before I better go in. I went in there and she was sitting on the side of the bed, and she said, "I think I'm dead." And I tell you what, it didn't bloody wake me up quickly. So I put my arm around her and said, "No, you're still here, don't worry." I just want to pay tribute to Neil and Jenny and everybody in the village who's really been a lot of help and support and comfort. Neil and Rosemary have been a bit like an old married couple, because you'd see them there bitching at each other and carping, but there was a lot of love under the surface between the two, and we're very grateful for what you've done, Neil. And Jenny, sorry. We've got a Thanksgiving here, but really Mum didn't want a funeral. She didn't want any fuss, really. Particularly she just had 100. She'd actually left her body to medical research, to Bristol University. And we'd all wondered what they would find at Bristol University for 100 years. What was the secret to such a long life? But we'll never know, because they had to reject her body because technically she had COVID in the last few days, which is a shame. And my plan was always, because we live in Leicestershire, so we go up the M5. I said, "Don't worry, we can drop you off there on the way back." I've got to do it. Her final journey, so we will take her ashes back up to her beloved Glenogle in Scotland, and she will be reunited with the other members of her family. So, who's next, Neil? Okay.
If it wasn't for Mum, Donald, Andy and I wouldn't be here in the first place, but more particularly for me in Thurleston, which I've grown to love, especially all of the lovely people in Thurleston. I wouldn't have spent 3.5 years of quality time with my mum after missing out on about 40 years of short yearly visits, because I was in Canada. Also, I wouldn't have spent more quality time with all my relatives. So thank you, Mum, for that. Mum had a magnificent way of connecting with people, whether it was through her personality, her actions, or through her culinary talents. She loved being with people, and people loved being with her. She embraced the people of Thurleston, and they embraced her like one of their own. I can't begin to count the number of people who would just drop in to either 3B Lane Path or 12B Mead Lane over the years, and Mum just threw herself into almost all the village activities with a passion. Here's a list of all the activities that I could come up with for this wonderful woman, and forgive me if I've missed anything out. Tennis, badminton, golf, village voice, dinner parties, tramp walks, Women's Institute, Cookworthy Museum volunteering, monthly coffee and lunches, gardening, painting and embroidery, bridge cards, Scrabble, Rummy Hub, Women's Institute, NADFest. Am I boring you yet? Cooking and entertaining, and walking the cat and the dog. And let's not forget the magnificent 100-year celebration. A truly remarkable range of activities, unequaled by almost any of her fellow villagers. Her crowning glory was the recent celebration of her 100 years in November last year. This is the same lady who had completed her golden wedding anniversary with husband Bruce when he was alive, her 80th birthday, her 90th birthday, all here in the Thurlestone Parish Hall. For those of you who weren't at the 100th celebration, we had a card and a visit in the form of a life-size cutout of Her Majesty, as well as family and friends. You may see some pictures of the celebration as the photo montage develops. In true keeping with both occasions, we're talking about the 100th celebration, Mum proceeded to lecture us on, wait for it, the criminal justice system. Why not? A typical haranguing and another of her glorious non sequiturs. John Davey, could you translate that into English for us? It doesn't follow on, for which she became quite famous. How we will miss those moments, and her delicious coronation chicken, homemade cheese biscuits, shortbread and oatcakes, to name a few. Mum was in her element cooking and hosting all her many friends and relatives, even into her late 90s. About 7 years ago, at the tender age of 93, she was beginning to wonder if she'd ever have any great-grandchildren. After her younger sister Jean, who sadly couldn't be here today, had already had several, then all of a sudden, in the space of a few short years, she had 5. 4 of them in Canada from my 2 sons, Sean and Tristan, and the most recent addition, Ada, from Ed and Kate, who are my older brother Donald's son and daughter-in-law. For those of you who don't know, Mum loved the colour green. The brighter the better. That's why some of us are wearing green in her honour. Our upper and lower clothing shouted out all shades of green, ranging from olive green to bright emerald green. Mum was very loyal to all her friends and relatives, but especially to her dogs and cats. Her latest reincarnation of Labrador, Heidi, has been perhaps one of the most mischievous of all the many Labradors that she's been surrounded by throughout her long life. In fact, Heidi was single-handedly responsible for Mum giving up driving. One day, in Mum's early 90s, Heidi had escaped from the house and, as usual, made her way down to the hotel, looking for scraps of food and willing staff. When Mum got one of the many calls from the hotel to go and pick her up, they had her phone number taped to the switchboard, by the way. Mum was particularly busy, and the last thing she had time for was to pick up the errant hound. Nonetheless, she drove down to the hotel, parked her car, put it in park, got a little flustered by her rush, and drove into the car in front of her, thinking she'd put the car into park. Then panicking, she put the car in reverse and went into another car behind her. Thus, she and the police decided, enough of driving. Personally, I think her sixth sense was telling her that I'd soon be with her in Thurlestone to drive her to wherever she wanted. Her good friend and next-door neighbour, Al Parker, who sadly passed away last year, was a frequent visitor to 12B Mead Lane. and in fact had visited so often that he said he was going to make a hole in the wall between the two flats to enable an easier route. We all wondered what this might lead to. Her good friends Beryl and Mac, who are here today, I'm sorry to say that Mac made it, but it would have been nice if he'd just stayed at home. Beryl and Mac, her good friends, and Al Parker and Mum would park at Loxley House where Mac and Beryl live and run down to the sea and take a dip just like three excited children at the tender age of 80 plus. Latterly, after much persuasion from me, Mum decided that she needed some more exercise and took up walking round the Mead and in Thurleston with her good friend Joe Parkin, who again sadly is not here today, together with Heidi and Archie the cat. She chatted up most of the neighbours, and one of the more endearing moments was a classic photo, which you'll see on one of these tables, of taken by her good friend George Lacon, of her walking along Landpath with her wheelie, followed by Heidi and Archie in tow. In her last years, with COVID rearing its ugly head, Mum found a way to satiate her appetite for games by playing frequent games of Rummikub and Scrabble with Jenny and myself, winning, I might add, a large percentage of those games before and after she turned 100. Another endearing moment recently was seeing her watch lovingly from her balcony as her family played croquet on the front lawn during her 100th birthday celebrations. The look on her face seemed to say, "I'm so glad I made it. And all the family, my sons, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are here one more time to help me celebrate." Mum had many friends, too many to mention, but a lot here today. I know how much she appreciated their friendship and kindness. And without mentioning names, they'll know who they are. My mum had an amazing life, was truly a special lady, and we're here to celebrate that life. So charge your glasses or teacups and raise them to my wonderful mum.